The morning started, like any other Thursday, in the quiet suburban neighborhood of Willowbrook Estates. The sun was barely peeking over the horizon when Judge Margaret Chen pulled into her driveway after an exhausting night shift at the federal courthouse, where she had been reviewing emergency motions until 3 in the morning. At 52 years old, Margaret had dedicated nearly 3 decades to the legal profession, working her way up from a public defender to her current position as a United States District Court judge. Her modest 2-story colonial home was her sanctuary, the one place where she could escape the weight of the black robe and simply be herself. What Margaret didn't know, as she dragged herself through the front door that morning, was that her peaceful sanctuary was about to become ground zero for the most brazen violation of privacy she had ever experienced outside of a courtroom. And the perpetrator wasn't some hardened criminal or sophisticated fraudster. No, it was something far more terrifying. An HOA board president with a clipboard, a superiority complex, and absolutely no understanding of the law. Margaret had moved into Willowbrook Estates 6 months earlier, seeking a quieter neighborhood after her divorce was finalized. The house had been perfect good bones, a reasonable price, and a location close enough to the courthouse for her unpredictable schedule. During the home buying process, she had glossed over the HOA documents, assuming they were the standard fare about lawn maintenance and exterior paint colors. She had been too focused on starting her new chapter to pay much attention to the fine print. That oversight was about to come back to haunt her in ways she never could have imagined. The HOA was run by a woman named Patricia Drummond, though everyone in the neighborhood knew her simply as the President, a title she wielded like a weapon. Patricia was 63, recently retired from a middle management position at an insurance company, and had apparently decided that running a homeowners association would give her life the purpose and authority she craved. She had short, severely cut gray hair, wore oversized glasses that magnified her already judgmental eyes, and seemed to own nothing but pantsuits in various shades of beige and gray. Patricia took her role seriously, too seriously, according to most residents conducting daily patrols of the neighborhood in her white Honda CR-V, armed with her smartphone camera and that ever-present clipboard. Margaret's first interaction with Patricia had occurred 3 weeks after moving in. She had come home from court to find a violation notice tucked into her front door, citing her for having a trash can visible from the street on a non-collection day. The citation came with a $50 fine. Margaret had been irritated but paid it, chalking it up to learning the quirks of her new neighborhood. The second violation came 2 weeks later when one of her rose bushes died and turned brown, apparently creating an eyesore that violated the community aesthetics clause. Another $50. The third violation was for parking her car in the driveway instead of the garage one evening when she was too exhausted to deal with the clutter inside. That one cost her $75 because it was her third offense. By the 4th month, Margaret had received 12 violations, totaling nearly $800 in fines. The infractions were increasingly petty: a small oil stain on her driveway, a garden gnome that was apparently not on the approved decorations list, a package left on her porch for more than 24 hours, and most absurdly, hanging a wreath on her door 2 days before the HOA-approved holiday decoration period began. Margaret had tried reasoning with Patricia through emails, carefully worded and professional, explaining her irregular work schedule as a federal judge and requesting some flexibility. Patricia's responses were terse and uncompromising, often citing section and subsection numbers from the HOA bylaws as if they were constitutional amendments. What Margaret didn't realize was that Patricia had become obsessed with her. The judge's irregular hours, her expensive car, her tendency to keep to herself, all of it made Patricia suspicious. In Patricia's mind, Margaret was either hiding something or thought herself too important to follow the rules that governed everyone else. Patricia had begun keeping detailed logs of Margaret's comings and goings, photographing her property from the street, and discussing her concerns with other board members, most of whom nodded along uncomfortably. too afraid of Patricia's wrath to disagree. The situation escalated when Patricia convinced the HOA board to pass a new rule allowing for random home inspections to ensure compliance with interior maintenance standards. The rule was buried in a dense email sent to all residents on a Friday evening, with the important details hidden in paragraph 7 of a 12-paragraph message. Most residents never read it. Margaret certainly hadn't. She had been in the middle of a high-profile criminal trial and was drowning in motions, exhibits, and witness testimonies. An HOA email was the last thing on her mind. On that fateful Thursday morning, as Margaret finally made it home after her grueling night at the courthouse, she wanted nothing more than to collapse into bed. She kicked off her heels in the entryway, dropped her briefcase and judicial robes on the couch, and headed upstairs. Her home was neat but lived in. Legal pads covered the dining room table where she often worked on weekends. Books lined the shelves in her study, legal treatises, case reporters, and her personal collection of mystery novels. The kitchen had dishes in the sink from a hasty breakfast 2 days ago. It was the home of a busy professional, not a showroom, and that was exactly how she liked it. Margaret had just changed into comfortable pajamas and was about to crawl into bed when she heard it, the unmistakable sound of her front door opening. Her blood ran cold. She froze, listening intently. Footsteps. Multiple people, moving through her first floor. Someone was in her house. Every instinct screamed at her to call the police, but years on, the bench had also taught her to assess situations carefully. She crept to her bedroom door and listened. The voices were female, not whispering but speaking in normal tones. One voice was familiar in the most infuriating way possible. It was Patricia. Margaret's confusion turned to rage as she heard Patricia's distinctive nasal tone directing someone to take photos of the living room. The judge grabbed her phone, switched it to video record, and quietly made her way down the stairs. The scene that greeted her in her own living room was so surreal that for a moment she thought she might still be asleep, trapped in some bizarre stress dream. Patricia stood in the middle of Margaret's living room, clipboard in hand, while a younger woman, who Margaret later learned was Patricia's niece, snapped photos with a professional camera. A third woman, another HOA board member named Sandra, was actually opening Margaret's kitchen cabinets and inspecting inside, shaking her head disapprovingly at the organization. Margaret's voice, when she finally found it, came out with the icy authority of someone who had spent years commanding courtrooms filled with hostile witnesses and contemptuous defendants. The three intruders jumped, spinning around to face her. Patricia's initial shock lasted only a moment before her face settled into an expression of righteous indignation, as if Margaret was the one in the wrong for interrupting them. Patricia launched into an explanation about the new inspection policy, waving her clipboard like it was a warrant signed by the Supreme Court itself. She rattled off section numbers and subsections, explaining that the HOA had the right to conduct inspections with proper notice, which had been provided in the email sent 3 weeks prior. Margaret's failure to respond to the email constituted consent under the new bylaws. Patricia's tone was condescending, speaking slowly as if explaining basic concepts to a child, making it clear that she expected Margaret to simply accept this invasion and cooperate. Margaret stood there in her pajamas, phone still recording, and felt a wave of disbelief wash over her. In all her years practicing law, then serving on the bench, she had seen people make catastrophically bad decisions. But this breaking into a home to conduct an unauthorized inspection based on HOA bylaws that no reasonable person would consider legally enforceable, this was something special. This was the kind of profound legal ignorance that would make an excellent teaching example for first-year law students studying criminal trespass and breaking and entering statutes. Patricia continued her speech, now pointing out various violations she had already identified in just the few minutes they'd been inside. The legal documents on the dining room table were a fire hazard. The coat rack near the door wasn't on the approved furniture list. The dishes in the sink violated the cleanliness standards. Each violation came with a proposed fine, which Patricia announced with barely concealed glee. She had been building this case against Margaret for months, and now she finally had the evidence she needed to prove that the judge wasn't as perfect as she thought she was. What Patricia failed to notice in her self-righteous tirade was the way Margaret's expression had shifted from shock to something far more dangerous. It was the same expression Margaret wore in court when a witness perjured themselves, or when an attorney tried to pull a fast one. It was the calm before a legal storm, the quiet moment when someone who truly understood the law was about to demonstrate exactly how badly someone else had miscalculated. Margaret asked Patricia a simple question. How did they enter the house? Patricia responded proudly that they had used the emergency key, which the HOA required all homeowners to provide for situations exactly like this. Margaret didn't remember providing any such key. Patricia, sensing skepticism, explained that it was in the HOA documents Margaret had signed at closing. All homeowners were required to provide access in case of emergencies or inspections. If Margaret had failed to provide one, the HOA had the right to have a locksmith create one, with costs billed to the homeowner. Sandra chimed in helpfully that they had indeed hired a locksmith 2 weeks ago after Margaret ignored their repeated requests. The absurdity of the situation would have been funny if it weren't so egregiously illegal. Margaret took a deep breath, collecting her thoughts. She had two choices. She could immediately identify herself as a federal judge and watch these women scramble for the door, or she could let this play out a bit longer and see just how deep they were willing to dig themselves into this hole. Professional curiosity won out. After all, she was still recording. Patricia, interpreting Margaret's silence as intimidation, pressed her advantage. She pulled out a thick folder from her bag, explaining that she had been documenting Margaret's violations for months. There were photos of Margaret's property taken from the street, time-stamped records of her comings and goings, notes about visitors to her home, and detailed accounts of every minor infraction. Patricia had even documented the make and model of Margaret's car, noting that while it was technically within HOA guidelines, it was more expensive than what most residents drove, suggesting an attitude of superiority. As Margaret listened to Patricia's presentation, she realized this wasn't just about HOA enforcement. This was harassment bordering on stalking, an obsessive campaign against her by someone who had too much time and too much perceived authority. The documentation Patricia was so proudly displaying would be Exhibit A in what Margaret was already mentally drafting as a restraining order petition. But Patricia wasn't done. She began outlining a payment plan for Margaret's accumulated fines, which now totaled over $3,000 with the new interior violations included. If Margaret couldn't pay immediately, the HOA would place a lien on her property. Patricia's tone suggested she thought she was being generous by offering the payment plan at all. The other two women had gone quiet, perhaps sensing that something wasn't quite right about the situation. Sandra had stopped her cabinet inspection and was edging toward the door. The niece had lowered her camera, her earlier enthusiasm dampened by the strange calm emanating from the homeowner they had just invaded. But Patricia was too caught up in her moment of triumph to read the room. She had been waiting months to put this uppity newcomer in her place, and she wasn't about to let the opportunity slip away. That was when Margaret decided it was time to end the show. She stopped recording, saved the video to her cloud storage, and then calmly asked Patricia if she had finished her inspection. Patricia, sensing victory, said that she had seen enough to issue the violations and would be sending the formal citations via certified mail. Margaret nodded thoughtfully, then asked one more question. Did Patricia know what Margaret did for a living? Patricia's response dripped with disdain. She said she didn't care if Margaret was a CEO or a doctor or whatever she thought made her special. In Willowbrook Estates, everyone followed the same rules. There were no exceptions for people who thought they were better than everyone else. Margaret allowed herself the smallest smile. She informed Patricia that she was indeed something that Patricia should have known about. a United States District Court judge for the Central District, appointed to the federal bench 7 years ago after serving as a magistrate judge for 5 years before that. The color drained from Patricia's face so quickly that for a moment Margaret thought the woman might actually faint. Sandra let out a small gasp. The niece dropped her camera, which fortunately was hanging from a strap around her neck. Margaret continued in the same calm, measured tone she used in court. She explained that Patricia and her companions had committed multiple felonies in the last 20 minutes: breaking and entering, criminal trespass, illegal surveillance, harassment. She had it all on video, along with Patricia's own admission that they had hired a locksmith to create an unauthorized key to access Margaret's private residence. Patricia tried to stammer out a response about the HOA bylaws, about the authority granted to the board, about the email notification. Margaret cut her off with a simple legal truth. No HOA bylaw, no matter how carefully worded or officially voted upon, could supersede state and federal criminal law. An HOA cannot grant itself the authority to enter private residences without actual consent from the homeowner. The clause Patricia was citing would never hold up in court, and the email notification failed to meet any legal standard for consent. If Patricia had consulted with an attorney before implementing this inspection policy, any competent lawyer would have told her she was creating massive liability for herself and the HOA. But Margaret wasn't done. She pulled up her phone and began reading from the criminal code, citing specific statutes that Patricia had violated, complete with potential sentencing ranges. Each charge carried the possibility of fines and imprisonment. Margaret's tone remained professional, almost professorial, as if she were teaching a legal seminar rather than informing 3 intruders that they had committed multiple felonies. She explained how intent would be evaluated, how their admission of pre-planning would be used against them, how the documentation Patricia had so carefully compiled would actually serve as evidence of harassment and stalking behaviors. Patricia's legs seemed to give out, and she sank onto Margaret's couch without invitation. The clipboard slipped from her hands, papers scattering across the floor. Sandra was openly crying now, mumbling about how she had told Patricia this was a bad idea but had been too afraid to stand up to her. The niece looked like she wanted to disappear into the floor, realizing that her aunt's promised payment for photography work had just turned into potential complicity in multiple crimes. Margaret let the silence hang for a moment, watching the reality sink in. Then she made her offer. She wanted them out of her house immediately. She wanted the illegally made key destroyed and proof of its destruction provided to her within 24 hours. She wanted a written apology from Patricia and full resignation from the HOA board, effective immediately. She wanted all fines issued to her voided and any documentation of her activities destroyed, with written confirmation that no copies existed in any form. And she wanted a new HOA board elected that would review and revise the bylaws with input from an actual real estate attorney to ensure nothing like this ever happened to another resident. If Patricia complied with all these demands within 72 hours, Margaret would not press criminal charges. She would not file a civil lawsuit for invasion of privacy, harassment, and emotional distress, though she made it clear she had grounds for damages that would likely exceed Patricia's assets. She would not file a complaint with the State Attorney General's office about the HOA's illegal practices. She would simply move on with her life and let Patricia fade into the obscurity she deserved. But if Patricia resisted, if she tried to retaliate, if she breathed one word of protest or attempted to issue even one more fine, Margaret would unleash the full force of the legal system on her. And given Margaret's position, her connections throughout the legal community, and the absolutely ironclad case she had with video evidence and Patricia's own documentation, that would be a battle Patricia would lose spectacularly. Margaret made sure Patricia understood that judges talk to each other, that attorneys talk to each other, and that Patricia's name would become synonymous with cautionary tales about HOA overreach in legal circles throughout the region. Patricia managed a weak nod, unable to form words. Margaret escorted all three women to the door, waiting as they stumbled out into the bright morning sunlight. She watched them climb into Patricia's Honda CR-V and drive away, noting the license plate number for good measure, though she already had it from her earlier research into Patricia's harassment campaign. Once they were gone, Margaret locked her door, engaged the deadbolt and chain that Patricia had somehow bypassed, and finally allowed herself to feel the full weight of what had just happened. Someone had broken into her home, invaded her privacy, and violated her sense of security in the one place she should have felt safe. The violation was profound, and despite her calm exterior, she was shaking with anger and adrenaline. She spent the next hour documenting everything, downloading the video from her phone, making detailed notes of every statement Patricia had made, and organizing Patricia's own documentation that the woman had conveniently left behind in her panic. Margaret also pulled the HOA documents she had signed at closing, reading through them carefully with the eye of a judge rather than an exhausted homebuyer. The inspection clause Patricia cited was indeed there, buried in paragraph 47 of a 60-page document. But it was so broadly written and so clearly in violation of basic property law that Margaret knew it would never survive legal scrutiny. No attorney worth their license would have drafted it, which suggested the HOA had either written their own bylaws or hired the cheapest, most incompetent lawyer they could find. By afternoon, Margaret had received an email from Patricia. The message was barely coherent, rambling between apologies and attempts to justify the inspection before finally accepting all of Margaret's demands. The key was destroyed. Patricia included a photo of it broken in half. She was resigning from the board effective immediately and would be announcing a special election for new leadership. All of Margaret's fines were voided. The documentation would be destroyed within 24 hours, with a sworn affidavit provided to confirm its destruction. Patricia's attorney, apparently she had finally consulted one, had attached a separate note, making it clear that his client understood the severity of her actions and was committed to full compliance with Judge Chen's requirements. Margaret forwarded the email to her own attorney, a colleague who specialized in real estate and HOA law, just to have someone else review the compliance. Her friend called within an hour, laughing so hard she could barely speak. She had heard of HOA horror stories, but this one took the prize. She assured Margaret that Patricia had indeed complied with everything, and that the resignation letter would hold up if Patricia ever tried to reclaim her position. She also offered to represent Margaret for free if the HOA ever gave her any trouble in the future, partly out of friendship and partly because she wanted to be involved in such an absurd case. The next day, the locksmith arrived with documentation showing that Patricia had paid him to create a key to Margaret's home, claiming she was the homeowner and had lost her key. The locksmith, now aware that he had been duped into facilitating a crime, provided a sworn statement to Margaret and replaced all her locks free of charge. He also mentioned that Patricia had done this for 3 other homes in the neighborhood, information that Margaret quietly passed along to those residents through anonymous notes. Within a week, the neighborhood was buzzing with news of Patricia's resignation and the reasons behind it. Margaret never publicly discussed what happened, but Patricia's own board members filled in the gaps, apparently relieved to finally be free of her tyrannical leadership. The special election brought in new board members, who immediately hired a real estate attorney to review the bylaws. The inspection clause was eliminated entirely, along with dozens of other problematic provisions. The fine schedule was dramatically reduced and restructured to focus on actual nuisances rather than petty aesthetic preferences. Patricia herself seemed to disappear from neighborhood life. Her house went up for sale 2 months later, and she moved before the summer ended. The neighbors who had lived in fear of her daily patrols and violation notices seemed lighter, friendlier, more willing to wave and chat. The neighborhood Facebook group, once filled with complaints about citations and fears about breaking obscure rules, became a normal community space for sharing recommendations and organizing social events. Margaret settled back into her quiet life, her home once again the sanctuary she needed. She had the security system upgraded, more out of principle than genuine fear, and made sure her new locks were high quality. The irony wasn't lost on her that she spent her professional life dealing with criminals who at least knew they were breaking the law, while her most egregious home invasion had come from someone who thought she was enforcing it. 6 months later, Margaret was presiding over a case involving a homeowners association that had exceeded its authority in a different neighborhood. The attorneys on both sides were making passionate arguments about the scope of HOA powers and the limits of their enforcement capabilities. Margaret listened patiently, asked probing questions, and ultimately issued a ruling that clearly defined the boundaries of what HOAs could and couldn't do. Her written opinion became a cited precedent in real estate law, used in law schools, and by attorneys handling similar cases. Nowhere in the opinion did she mention her personal experience, but those who knew her story could see echoes of it in her careful analysis of privacy rights and the limits of private governance. The opinion included a memorable line that made its way into several legal journals and even some mainstream news articles about HOA overreach. Margaret had written that while homeowners associations serve valuable purposes in maintaining communities, they must remember that they govern neighborhoods, not nations, and that their authority is limited by the same laws that govern everyone else. No amount of bylaw drafting or board voting can grant an organization powers that violate fundamental rights to privacy and security in one's own home. The sentence was quoted approvingly by judges across the country in subsequent HOA cases. For Margaret, the entire incident became a bizarre footnote in her judicial career, though one that reinforced her commitment to protecting individual rights against overreach, whether from government agencies or self-important neighborhood busybodies with clipboards. She continued her work on the federal bench, handling cases far more serious than HOA disputes. But she never forgot that morning when she discovered intruders in her home, or the look on Patricia's face when she realized she had broken into a judge's residence. The new HOA board sent Margaret a formal apology on behalf of the community and invited her to join the board herself, given her legal expertise. She politely declined, explaining that her schedule didn't permit it and that she preferred to keep her work life and home life separate. But she did offer to review any proposed bylaw changes pro bono, just to ensure the community didn't find itself in legal trouble again. The board gratefully accepted, and Margaret's quiet oversight helped transform Willowbrook Estates into one of the most legally sound and resident-friendly HOAs in the region. As for Patricia, Margaret occasionally wondered what became of her. She heard through the neighborhood gossip chain that Patricia had moved to a condo with no HOA, perhaps having learned her lesson about the limits of power. Margaret hoped that was true, though she suspected Patricia was probably just planning her comeback in some other unsuspecting community. Some people never learned, no matter how expensive the lesson. But for Margaret, the lesson was different. It was a reminder that the law wasn't just something that existed in courtrooms and legal briefs. It was the framework that protected everyone's fundamental rights, from the highest levels of government all the way down to neighborhood associations. And sometimes those protections meant standing in your pajamas in your own home, explaining to intruders exactly how many laws they had just broken. It wasn't how she had imagined starting her day that Thursday morning, but it had certainly been memorable. And in the end, justice had been served not in a courtroom, but in a living room, with nothing more than a phone recording and a calm recitation of the criminal code. The incident left Margaret with a new appreciation for the importance of knowing your rights, reading the fine print, and standing up to bullies, no matter what authority they claimed to have. It also gave her a great story for legal conferences, though she always told it anonymously, changing names and locations to protect everyone involved. Judges at those conferences would shake their heads in disbelief, then share their own stories of HOA overreach and administrative absurdity. Margaret's story usually won for the most dramatic personal encounter, though there was stiff competition. In the end, The broken locks were replaced, the illegal documentation was destroyed, the tyrant was deposed, and the community was reformed. Margaret got her peace back, her sanctuary restored, and her faith in the legal system reinforced. And somewhere, Patricia Drummond learned the hardest way possible that having a clipboard and a position on an HOA board doesn't make you above the law, especially when you break into a federal judge's house to prove it.